The Texas sun beat down on the cracked earth, relentless as time itself. Lenina Carter stood on the edge of her father's parched land, staring at the dry, hollow horizon. She could almost hear her father's weak voice behind her, the weight of impending loss hanging in the air. The cattle were sickly, the creek was running dry, and the land, once full of promise, now felt like a dying memory. Her hands clenched at her sides. The bank wanted their payment, and if they didn't make it to Copper Springs with 500 heads by October 15th, the land was gone. The name Wallace Tane echoed in her mind, a cattle baron who'd been waiting for this moment. She'd promised her father she wouldn't let them fall. But the question weighed heavy. How far would she go to keep her promise? Lenina's father, Thomas Carter, sat slumped on the porch, staring at the land with hollow eyes, the weight of years pressing him down. The drought had stolen more than the grass. It had taken his health, his strength. His hands shook when he lifted a letter from his coat pocket, a letter that carried the last of the bad news. "You heard from the bank, didn't you?" Lenina's voice was steady, but inside, her stomach tightened. There was no point in asking. She could see it in his eyes, the acceptance of defeat. But they weren't done yet. Thomas nodded, the movement slow and tired. 60 days, 60 days, to get 500 head to Copper Springs, or Wallace Tane will take it all. He let out a long breath, a mix of frustration and resignation. The letter says we have until October 15th. Yanina's jaw tightened. The number sounded impossible. She scanned the pasture where her cattle stood, thin and restless, nibbling at the dried-up grass. They had 400 at best, and half of them were too weak to make the drive. "We need 20 men minimum to pull this off," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "and we don't have the money to pay them." "I know," her father whispered. His eyes wandered over the land, the field that had once been a prosperous ranch, now a shadow of what it used to be. Lenina swallowed the anger rising in her chest. They couldn't let it end like this. Not now. Not when her father had fought for every inch of this land. "Wallace Tane has been circling us for years, waiting for us to fall," she muttered. "This is it, Pa. We need to make it work, or we lose everything." Thomas's hands trembled, and he lowered his head, the weight of it all settling on his shoulders. He wasn't the same man who had once stood tall and proud, running the Carter ranch with energy and determination. The drought had drained him, and now it was only the two of them, her and him, alone against the world. The door creaked open behind them, and Lenina turned to see her younger brother's empty room, his boots still lined by the bed. Edmund had been dead for years, but it was still hard to shake the ghost of the boy who had never gotten the chance to grow up. The absence of her mother, who had died giving birth to Edmund, only made the house feel colder. That night, while her father slept, Janina sat at the kitchen table, the flicker of the kerosene lamp casting shadows on the walls. The shears her mother had once used lay on the table before her. Lenina took a deep breath and picked them up. It was time for her to become someone else. She began to cut her long, dark hair. It fell in thick strands around her, the sharp snip of the shears ringing in the stillness. When she finished, she looked at her reflection in the window. The face staring back at her was different, leaner, sharper, determined. She bound her chest tightly with strips of old cotton and buttoned her brother's shirt, the fabric hanging loosely around her frame. She tugged on his old trousers, buckled the belt, and pulled on a brown leather duster. She was no longer Lenina Carter. She was Elias Carter, the ranch hand. The change felt strange, but it felt necessary. She had to do this. There was no other choice. By dawn, Elias Carter rode out of the yard. Lenina, her face now a mask of determination, didn't look back. She wasn't sure if she could do it, but she had to try. If she didn't, the Carter name would disappear along with the ranch, and she couldn't let that happen. Not after everything. Her father was awake when she walked back inside. The coffee cup froze in his hand, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Good God, Lenina," he whispered, voice cracking. "What have you done?" Quote. Elias lowered her voice, rough and gruff like she imagined a man's would be. We start today." Her father blinked back tears, his eyes softening with regret. "You sound just like Edmund would have," he murmured, his voice filled with pride and fear. "Then it'll work." Elias poured herself a cup of coffee and spoke like a stranger. "The word's going around town. Carter Ranch needs hands for a 60-day drive. A new trail boss is hiring. That's me." The tremor in her father's hand as he reached for hers told her everything she needed to know. She'd done the right thing. "Your mother would have been proud," he said softly. "Terrified," Elias replied with a faint smile. "But proud." Quote, 3 days later, Elias rode into Stillwater Creek. The town was nothing more than a collection of buildings, a single dirt street, and a saloon that reeked of whiskey and regret. Men lingered in front of the saloon, eyes following Elias as he dismounted. Inside, the smoky air felt heavy, thick, with tobacco and unspoken words. Elias approached the bar, voice low but confident. "I'm hiring drovers. 20 men for a 60-day push to Copper Springs. $40 a man, meals and remounts included." The bartender raised an eyebrow. "Fair pay? Who's hiring?" "Carter Ranch." Elias's words were firm. "I'm Elias Carter, foreman for the drive." A rough laugh came from the corner of the room. A scar-faced drifter, known to be a troublemaker, sneered. "Carter Ranch? Tom Carter's half-crippled, and his daughter's out there playing cowboy. You wasting your time, boy?" Elias turned slowly. "I'm not here to waste anyone's time. You in, or you running your mouth for free?" The tension in the room shifted as the drifter's smirk faltered. Before he could respond, the saloon door swung open. 3 men entered. The leader wore a black suit, polished boots gleaming in the low light. Spencer Taine. Elias's eyes narrowed. Spencer Taine. The name alone was enough to raise the hairs on the back of her neck. Wallace Taine's nephew. Just the man she didn't need on this drive. The room fell silent as Spencer Taine swept through the saloon, his polished boots clicking sharply against the floor, his silver watch chain catching the low light. The very air seemed to shift with his presence, as if the dust in the room paused to take notice. His 2 companions, rough-looking men dressed in faded work clothes, stood behind him, their eyes scanning the room like predators. The bartender didn't say anything, but the tension in the air was palpable. Spencer's gaze locked onto Elias, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. His sharp eyes studied the figure before him, the tall man who had once been Yanina's father's pride, now reduced to the shadow of the man he used to be. The trail boss he had heard rumors about, but Elias wasn't what he expected. "I heard someone mention Carter Ranch," Spencer said, his voice smooth, controlled. "That the outfit trying to scrape together a drive before the bank takes it?" Quote, Elias didn't flinch. "That's right. We're looking for 20 men to move 500 head to Copper Springs. Pays fair. $40 a man, plus meals and horses." Spencer's lips curled into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I see. I'm here because my uncle has a financial interest in your ranch." His words were as polished as his boots. "He's asked me to oversee this little cattle drive, make sure everything proceeds fairly." Yanina's gut clenched, but she kept her expression neutral. She knew exactly what this meant. Spencer's uncle, Wallace Taine, had been circling her family's land for years, waiting for them to falter. The ranch had been the Taine family's main competitor for decades, and now Spencer was here to make sure they failed. He wasn't just an observer, he was a tool for Wallace's schemes. "I don't need any oversight," Elias said, his voice flat, not giving an inch. "We know what we're doing." Quote, Spencer raised an eyebrow, but his smile remained unchanged. "Your uncle asked me to make sure the drive goes smoothly. That's my job." His eyes flicked over the men standing around the saloon. "I'll be joining you as an observer, unless of course you object." Elias shot him a look, cold and calculating. "Observers don't get paid." "I'm not asking for pay," Spencer replied smoothly. "I'm here to ensure that your little operation doesn't collapse before it even starts." Lenina could feel the heat in the room, the weight of Spencer's presence pressing down on her like a storm on the horizon. The tension between them was undeniable, but she wasn't going to let him rattle her. "If you want to be useful," she said, her voice steady, "ride, drag, Stay out of the way, and we'll get this done." Spencer's gaze flickered, but his expression didn't change. He tipped his hat back slightly, revealing the sharp lines of his face, and his smile faltered, just for a second. "Fair enough," he said, his tone almost amused. "But I warn you, Elias, it's going to be a long, hard journey, and I don't think your crew's up to it." "Then maybe you should have brought more men," Elias retorted. Spencer leaned against the bar, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You'll need all the help you can get." His voice was quieter now, less a threat and more a suggestion. "But I'll stay out of your way for now." As Spencer walked away, Elias turned to the bartender, his face a mask of calm. "Spread the word. Carter Ranch is hiring. $40, meals and horses provided. We leave in 3 days." The bartender nodded, his expression souring as he went to pass the word. Spencer might have been here to make sure they failed, but Elias wasn't about to let him interfere. She couldn't, not when everything was on the line. Elias stepped outside, the heat of the afternoon sun immediately hitting her skin. She could feel every eye on her as she walked through the dusty streets of Stillwater Creek. Behind her, Spencer's voice drifted out of the saloon, low and calm, speaking to the men gathered in the corner. They were all looking at her now, sizing her up, deciding whether they would follow a woman disguised as a man. 3 days, Elias muttered under her breath, looking up at the wide, cloudless sky. The road ahead of her seemed endless, stretching out to the horizon like a promise or a trap. She didn't know how they were going to pull this off, but she couldn't back down. Not now. By the time the sun began to set on the 3rd day, the crew was assembled. 15 men had signed on, and most of them looked desperate for any kind of work. Elias had done what she could, offered them a fair wage, promised them food and remounts, but she knew it wasn't enough to win their loyalty. Most of them were just looking for a quick payout. Still, it was better than nothing. The herd was ready, thin and restless, but still standing. The long drive ahead of them would be grueling, but they had no choice. The cattle were her family's last hope. As Elias rode out to the head of the herd, she felt the weight of her disguise pressing against her. Her chest was bound tight, her trousers too loose, but the brown leather duster hung heavy on her shoulders. She couldn't let anyone see who she truly was. Not yet, not until she'd made it to Copper Springs. Behind her, Spencer rode in silence, his eyes never leaving her. He hadn't spoken to her since they left Stillwater Creek, but she could feel his gaze, sharp and assessing. He had the look of a man who was constantly calculating, always 3 steps ahead. It was a look that made her uneasy, but she refused to show it. The road ahead was dusty, cracked from the summer heat. The landscape stretched wide and empty, and the cattle shuffled along, their hooves kicking up the dirt. They had a long way to go. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Elias rode beside the herd, scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. The night would come soon enough, and with it, the first test of their journey. How would they handle the cold, the exhaustion, and the endless miles? But as she rode, something nagged at her, an unease that she couldn't shake. It wasn't just the weight of the drive ahead of them. It wasn't just the fact that Wallace Tane was watching them from the shadows. It was Spencer. Elias glanced over at him. He was riding a fine blood bay mare, his posture impeccable even in the saddle. But there was something in the way he moved that suggested he wasn't just here to observe. He was watching her, watching Elias. For the first time since she'd donned the disguise, Elias wondered if she could really keep her secret. Or if Spencer Tane would find a way to destroy everything before they even reached Copper Springs. The days on the trail blended into one long stretch of dust and sweat. The sun rose early, the dry heat already choking the air by the time they began the day's march. Elias's throat was constantly parched, but there was no time to stop. The cattle needed to move. The men needed to work. And she was the one leading them, whether they liked it or not. The herd was restless, kicking up clouds of dust, their hooves striking the cracked earth with a rhythm that matched the steady beat of Elias's heart. The sky above them was wide and unforgiving, the sun beating down without mercy. It felt as though the land itself was testing them, pushing them to their limits. By the 3rd day of the drive, they had settled into a routine. The men rode at the sides of the herd, making sure none of the cattle strayed. Elias stayed at the front, eyes scanning the horizon, ever watchful for any sign of danger. The heat was relentless, but her resolve was even fiercer. Behind her, Spencer Tane remained close, always just behind, never getting too far ahead, but always close enough that she could feel the weight of his presence. He didn't speak much, but his eyes never left the herd, always calculating, always observing. Elias couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for something, waiting for her to make a mistake. Every time they passed a town or crossed a road, Spencer's eyes would narrow, his gaze flicking over the men and the cattle. His sharp, calculating stare never left her, but he never said a word. And Elias couldn't bring herself to say anything to him either. What could she say? The truth? That would ruin everything. And yet, part of her wondered, if he knew, would he help her, or would he use it against her? The drive grew harder by the day. The men were tired, their faces drawn with exhaustion. The cattle, too, were struggling, their ribs showing more with each passing mile. The creek they'd been hoping for had dried up, and the next water source was still a full day's ride away. Every night, they camped in makeshift circles, fires flickering in the dark, the men passing around what little food they had left. On the sixth day, a storm rolled in from the west, dark clouds gathering like a shadow over the land. The wind began to pick up, swirling dust into the air, and the temperature dropped sharply. The men began to murmur uneasily, watching the sky with concern. Elias wasn't worried. She'd been through worse storms, and she knew how to handle a herd in bad weather. But she could see the fear in the eyes of the men who had never driven cattle through a storm like this. They were already beginning to doubt her leadership, and she could feel it in the way they looked at her. The silence in camp was thick with unspoken words. Spencer rode up beside her, his mare steady, even in the wind. "The storm's moving fast. We need to get the herd to shelter before it hits." Elias didn't look at him, but she could hear the concern in his voice. She knew it wasn't just the storm he was worried about. It was her. They were both in over their heads, but she wouldn't let the men see it. She couldn't. "We'll hold them at the box canyon up ahead," she said, her voice firm despite the unease swirling in her chest. "We'll shelter them there." The storm hit with a ferocity that caught them off guard. The wind howled and the rain came down in sheets, cold and biting. The cattle balked, panicked by the sudden change in the air, their hooves scrambling against the slick ground. Elias shouted orders, pushing the herd forward through the rain, driving them toward the canyon. The men followed, shouting at the cattle, struggling to keep them moving. But the storm was too much. The cattle surged in all directions, panic taking over. The air was thick with the sound of hooves and shouting, the smell of wet leather and sweat. Elias rode at the front, trying to calm the herd, but the storm was relentless and the cattle were out of control. She didn't see the flash of lightning until it was too late. The bolt struck the ground nearby, the crack of thunder deafening. The ground shook beneath her horse's hooves, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The horses reared, the cattle scattered, and the men shouted in panic. Elias lost control of her mount as the horse bucked beneath her. She was thrown to the ground, pain exploding in her chest as she hit the wet earth. The world spun, the sound of hooves and thunder ringing in her ears. For a second, she couldn't breathe. Her ribs felt like they had been shattered, and her vision blurred as she struggled to push herself up. The wind howled, rain lashing her face, and she could hear Spencer's voice calling her name through the storm. "Elias!" quote. She forced herself to her knees, gasping for air. Her body screamed with pain, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let herself fall now. Through the rain, Spencer was there, his mare skidding to a halt beside her. "You need to get up," he said, his voice harsh with urgency. His hands reached for her, steadying her as she tried to stand. "We need to get you out of here." "I'm fine," she gritted through clenched teeth. "We need to." "No," he cut her off, his hand firm on her arm. "You're hurt. We're going to the canyon. Now." With his help, she climbed back onto her horse, the pain in her ribs sharp with every movement. The cattle were still scattering, but the men were already beginning to round them up, driven by the storm's fury. Spencer stayed close, riding beside her, his eyes scanning the chaos around them. They reached the canyon just as the storm reached its peak. The cattle were corralled inside the natural shelter, and the men quickly set up camp, their faces grim but determined. Elias was exhausted, her body aching, but she couldn't let the men see it. Not now. Not when they still had so far to go. As the storm raged on outside, Elias sat by the fire, her ribs throbbing with every breath. Spencer sat across from her, his face unreadable. The storm was loud, the wind howling around them, but it felt quieter between them. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her. That he knew. "You're reckless," Spencer said suddenly, his voice low and steady. "You can't keep doing this." "I don't have a choice," Elias replied, her voice firm despite the weariness in her bones. "If we don't keep moving, we lose everything." For a moment Spencer was silent, his eyes flicking to the fire before settling back on her. "I know," he said quietly, "but that doesn't mean you have to do it alone." Elias met his gaze, her heart thumping in her chest. She couldn't afford to let him get too close, couldn't afford to show weakness. But the truth was, she was starting to wonder if she could make it through this without him. Before she could respond, the sound of cattle lowing in the distance broke the silence. The storm might have passed, but their troubles were far from over. The storm passed as suddenly as it had come, leaving behind a stillness that felt like the calm before another storm. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and cattle, and the ground beneath them was slick, the mud making it harder to move. The men were exhausted, their faces drawn with the strain of the past few days. But they didn't complain. They couldn't afford to. The cattle were their only hope now, and without them, the Carter ranch would be nothing but a memory. Elias pushed herself up from the fire where she had been resting, her ribs aching with every movement. She didn't care. There was no time for weakness. The men needed her, the herd needed her, and she would do whatever it took to get them to Copper Springs. As she rode out to the front of the herd, her horse's hooves sloshed through the wet ground, the rainwater clinging to the earth beneath them. The cattle moved slowly, tired and sluggish from the storm, but they kept moving. That was all that mattered. Behind her, Spencer followed, as he always did. She could feel his gaze on her, even though he didn't speak. He had remained silent for most of the journey, his presence heavy in the air, his eyes always watching. Elias tried to ignore him, focusing on the task at hand. But there were moments, fleeting, quiet moments, when she wondered what he was thinking, what he saw when he looked at her. The drive continued, day after day, and the distance between them and Copper Springs began to shrink. But so did their strength. The men were growing more tired by the hour. The cattle were thinning out, their numbers dwindling as sickness and exhaustion took their toll. There had been a few close calls with rustlers, and the land was unforgiving, the hills growing steeper and the wind growing harsher. By the 12th day, Elias could feel the weight of the drive pressing down on her, harder than ever. She didn't speak much to the men, but she saw it in their faces. The doubt, the fear. They were starting to question if they could make it. She couldn't afford to let them see her doubt. She couldn't afford to let them see how close they were to the edge. But she could feel it too. The pressure was building. If they didn't make it to Copper Springs soon, they wouldn't make it at all. That night, as they camped in a small hollow between two hills, Elias sat apart from the others. Her eyes scanned the horizon, the last light of day slipping away, leaving the world dark and silent. The wind was still, and the cattle were resting, their weary bodies sprawled out on the ground. The men had settled by the fire, eating what little food they had left, but Elias couldn't bring herself to join them. Her thoughts were too heavy. The ranch. Her father. The secret she was keeping from everyone. Spencer. The sound of hooves drew her attention, and she turned to see him riding toward her, his mare moving easily through the dark. His silhouette was dark against the fading light, but she knew it was him before he even spoke. "You should be resting," Spencer said, his voice low, but There was a softness to it that Elias hadn't heard before. It was strange to hear that softness from a man like him. He had always been so calm, so calculating, but now there was something different in his tone, something that made Elias pause. "I'm fine," she replied, but even to her own ears, the words sounded hollow. She wasn't fine. She hadn't been fine in days. Spencer dismounted and stood beside her, the two of them staring out at the darkened horizon. The night had fallen cold, and the wind had picked up again, but Elias didn't feel it. She felt the weight of his presence beside her, a constant reminder of the fragile thread they were walking. "You've been pushing them hard," Spencer said after a long pause. "The men, the cattle." "I don't have a choice," she replied. "If we don't keep moving, we lose everything." There was a silence between them, and for a moment, Elias thought he might leave her to her thoughts. But instead, Spencer stayed, his eyes searching the darkness as if looking for something in the distance. "You're not like the others," he said softly. "The men, they're following you. They listen to you." Quote. Elias stiffened, the words catching her off guard. She hadn't expected him to say anything like that. Most men would have been quick to doubt her, quick to challenge her authority, but not Spencer. He had been quiet, but there was something in his eyes now that was different. "I'm just doing what needs to be done," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have the luxury of worrying about anything else." Spencer was quiet for a moment, and then, "You don't have to do it alone." Elias turned to face him, surprise flickering across her face. "What are you talking about?" "I've been with you for days now, Elias," he said, his voice steady. "I've seen what you're doing. I've seen how hard you're fighting. I know what this ranch means to you, but you don't have to do it alone." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Elias opened her mouth to reply, but she couldn't find the words. There was something about Spencer's voice, something in the way he spoke, that made her heart race. She couldn't figure out what he meant, whether he was offering help or something more. But for the first time in days, she let herself wonder. Before she could speak, a sharp shout broke through the silence. "Rustlers!" The men sprang to their feet, guns drawn, eyes scanning the night for any sign of movement. Elias's heart skipped a beat, and she turned quickly, her instincts kicking in. "They're coming fast," one of the men called out. "Stay sharp." "Get the herd!" Elias shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Stay close. Don't let them scatter." In an instant, Spencer was by her side, his mare ready, his eyes focused. "I'll take the rear," he said, his tone decisive. "You take the front. Keep the herd together." Elias nodded, her heart pounding as she turned back to the herd. The rustlers were close now, their horses thundering in the distance, and Elias knew this was their moment. This was their test. Would they hold together, or would they crumble under the pressure? She wouldn't let them crumble, not when they were so close to victory. The battle for the herd had begun. The night exploded into chaos. The rustlers had arrived, a group of masked riders appearing out of the darkness like ghosts, their horses thundering across the wet ground. The cattle, already on edge from the storm, scattered in every direction, their lowing a frenzied chorus of panic. Elias's heart raced, adrenaline surging through her veins as she turned her horse toward the herd, shouting orders. "Get the cattle under control! Push them toward the canyon! Keep them together!" Elias yelled, her voice cutting through the night air, sharp and demanding. Her words were met with the frantic sound of hooves and shouts from the men as they moved to surround the herd, keeping the cattle from bolting in different directions. Behind her, Spencer rode fast, his mare's hooves pounding the earth as he joined the men at the rear of the herd, driving them forward. The wind howled, and the air was thick with the sound of galloping horses and the men's voices. It was a race now, a battle against the clock and the rustlers who had come to take everything they had left. Elias focused on the herd, her every instinct telling her to keep the cattle moving, keep them together. The rustlers weren't just after the cattle. They were after everything, after the very thing that kept the Carter name alive. She could feel the weight of it, the pressure mounting with every second. There was no time to waste. If the cattle broke, they'd lose everything. She glanced over her shoulder. Spencer was still there, riding at the back of the herd, watching her every move. His face was set, his jaw tight as he kept pace, ensuring no one strayed. Elias pushed her horse harder, the animal responding beneath her, its breath heavy in the cold air. Ahead, the rustlers were closing in, their horses flickering in and out of the darkness. Luther Mason, one of the men they'd hired for the drive, rode up beside her. His face was grim, his hand steady on the reins. "We're almost at the canyon," he called over the noise. "We can hold them there." Quote. Elias nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Get 'em in there, we hold the line." The rustlers were fast, but the cattle were faster. Elias led them toward the canyon, the path narrow and winding, the walls on either side steep and jagged. The men, along with Spencer, drove the cattle hard, forcing them into the tight space between the cliffs. The rustlers were on them now, their riders breaking off, trying to cut through the herd. Elias's eyes narrowed as she turned to face them, her hand already on the rifle at her side. The first rustler came close, a dark figure on horseback, his hand reaching for a lasso. Elias's heart thudded in her chest. She kicked her horse forward, slapping the reins against its sides, and fired a warning shot into the air. "Stay back!" she shouted. "This is our herd." The rustler hesitated, his eyes flicking from her to the men behind her. He thought twice, then spurred his horse forward, riding past her with a snarl. The others followed, but Elias wasn't about to let them slip by. She took aim, her breath steady despite the pounding in her chest, and fired again. The shot rang out, echoing in the canyon, and the rustler fell to the ground, his horse bolting off in the other direction. The rest of the men scattered, but there were still more coming. Spencer had joined the fight, his gun drawn as he rode through the chaos. Elias caught a glimpse of him, his face set in grim determination, his eyes scanning the battlefield like a seasoned soldier. He was a force to be reckoned with, and for the first time since they'd begun the drive, Elias wasn't sure if she could do it without him. Another rider approached, this one faster, his hand steady on the reins. Luther shot first, but the rustler dodged, his horse veering to the side, and he took off, disappearing into the night. The fight raged on, the crack of gunfire mixing with the lowing of the cattle and the pounding of hooves. Elias felt the sweat bead on her forehead as she fought to keep the herd together, to keep the rustlers at bay. Every moment felt like a lifetime, but they couldn't stop, not now. As the minutes passed, the rustlers began to fade into the darkness. The cattle had been driven into the canyon, safe for the moment. Elias took a deep breath, her heart still racing as she surveyed the damage. 2 of their men were injured, and several cattle had broken free during the chaos. But they had held their ground. Spencer rode up beside her, his expression unreadable. "We lost some, but we've got most of them," he said, his voice low. "We need to move fast before they come back." Elias nodded, her mind already shifting to the next task. "We'll push through the canyon and rest the herd for the night. We need to make sure they're steady." "Let me take the rear," Spencer said, his voice firm. "I'll make sure no one's trailing us." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. They were all in this together now, whether she liked it or not. "Keep them together, Spencer," she said. "I'll keep the front steady." The men began to move, their horses worn and tired, but their resolve stronger than ever. Elias pushed forward, her mind sharp, the weight of the drive bearing down on her. But as she glanced back at Spencer, his eyes meeting hers in the flickering firelight, she knew one thing for certain. They were close now. Copper Springs was within reach, and no one, not the rustlers, not Wallace Tane, not the unforgiving land, was going to stop them now. By the time dawn broke over the horizon, they had made it to the edge of the canyon. The cattle, tired and sore, were still moving, their steps slow but steady. Elias's heart was still racing, her body aching, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing they had survived the night. The rustlers hadn't come back, and the herd was still intact. It wasn't enough to feel safe, but it was a start. They had survived the worst of the storm, the worst of the rustlers, and now they just had to make it the rest of the way. Copper Springs was just over the ridge, and if they could hold it together for one more day, they would have made it. The ranch would survive. Elias's family would survive. And maybe, just maybe, There was something more waiting for her at the end of this drive. Something beyond the land, beyond the herd. As the sun rose higher, casting golden light over the plains, Elias pushed forward, determined to make it to the finish line. The sun hung low in the sky as the Carter Ranch drive reached its final stretch. The air was dry and heavy, the land stretching endlessly ahead of them. The cattle, though weary, trudged forward, their steps growing slower with each passing mile. The dust that had followed them for days clung to their skin, and Elias felt the weight of the journey pressing down on her. But they were so close now. Copper Springs was just over the horizon, and everything she had fought for was within reach. As the herd crossed the last ridge and the town of Copper Springs came into view, Elias felt a surge of relief, brief but powerful. They had made it. The long, grueling journey had taken its toll, but they had survived. The cattle, the men, even herself. All of them had made it to the finish line. Behind her, Spencer rode alongside the herd, his face unreadable as always, but something about the way he moved, the quiet confidence in his posture, told her that he, too, knew they were on the brink of victory. Despite the tension that had hung between them since the beginning, despite the uncertainty that still lingered in her heart, he had been there, side by side with her every step of the way. As they rode into Copper Springs, the men who had been hired for the drive began to disperse, their work done, their pay earned. They had pushed through every obstacle, every hardship, but now it was time for them to part ways. The cattle would be sold, the debt paid, and the Carter Ranch would survive, at least for now. But Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something more was waiting for her here, the final test, the moment when everything would either fall into place or be lost forever. Inside the stockyard, the buyer, Martin Fletcher, stood waiting, his face impassive as he watched the herd being corralled. The deal had been set for weeks, and now, finally, it was time to complete it. Elias dismounted, her legs aching, and approached Martin with steady steps. "You've brought them all the way here," he said, glancing over the tired cattle. "But as we agreed, the price is based on the quality, not just the quantity." Elias met his gaze, unwavering. "We agreed on 500 head. I've delivered 243. They're healthy and alive." "That's what matters." Martin gave her a long look before nodding slowly. "I'll give you $32 a head, which comes to $7, $776. It's not enough to cover everything, but it will keep your ranch afloat for another season." Elias's stomach twisted, but she kept her expression neutral. It wasn't what she'd hoped for. It wasn't enough to erase the debt entirely, but it was something. The ranch would survive. Her family's legacy would endure for a little longer. As she turned to walk away, a voice called out from behind her, "You're selling out your father's land for pennies?" Elias froze. The voice was sharp, mocking, a voice she knew all too well. Wallace Tane. He stood in the doorway of the buyer's office, his presence as imposing as ever. Behind him, a group of men, his hired guns, lingered in the shadows, watching with amusement. Elias turned slowly to face him, her fists clenching at her sides. Wallace was a man who had spent years trying to tear her family apart. And now he was here, watching as she fought to keep what was rightfully hers. "This deal is done," Elias said evenly. "You've lost, Wallace. Your hold on this land is finished." Wallace's lips twisted into a sneer. "You think you've won?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Your precious cattle may be alive, but your father's ranch is still hanging by a thread. One more misstep, and it's mine." Elias stepped closer, her voice quiet but fierce. "You've been waiting for us to fall for years, but we're still standing, and we'll keep standing. As long as I'm here, you won't take this ranch." The tension in the air thickened. The men behind Wallace shifted, their hands resting on their gun handles, but they didn't make a move. Wallace looked down at her with contempt, his eyes cold and calculating. But for the first time in years, Elias didn't feel afraid. Before he could respond, Spencer stepped forward, his presence cutting through the confrontation like a knife. "That's enough, Uncle," Spencer said, his voice calm but firm. "You've made your point." Wallace's gaze shifted to Spencer, his expression darkening. You're siding with her now, boy? Spencer didn't flinch. I'm siding with what's right, and this ranch deserves to survive. It's not yours to take. For a long moment, Wallace said nothing. Then, with a final glare at Elias, he turned on his heel and stalked out of the stockyard, his men following in his wake. Elias stood there, stunned. For the first time in her life, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Spencer had sided with her. He had done what she had never expected him to do: stand up to his uncle, the man who had always held power over everything they had fought for. When she turned to look at Spencer, his eyes met hers, steady, calm, and full of something she hadn't expected to find: respect. You did the right thing, she said, her voice quieter now, the weight of the moment sinking in. Spencer nodded, his eyes still on hers. You've done more than anyone else ever could. You've kept your family's name alive. Elias swallowed the lump in her throat, her heart racing. I couldn't have done it without you. He smiled then, a small, quiet smile. I think we've both done our part. As they stood there in the fading light, the rest of the world seemed to disappear. The ranch, the cattle, the drive. It all felt distant now. All that mattered was that they had made it through together. Elias's thoughts turned to the future of the ranch, her father's health, and the man standing beside her. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing. They had earned their chance. Spencer reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver ring, simple but worn, as though it had seen its share of battles. I thought maybe you'd wear this, he said, his voice a little hesitant. Elias looked at the ring in his hand, then back up at him. She smiled, the weight of everything she had fought for lifting slightly. I'll wear it, she said softly. The sun sank behind them, casting a golden light over the land they had fought to save. And for the first time in a long time, Elias felt the quiet peace of knowing that, no matter what, they would rebuild. Together. If you felt this tale in your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Archives of the Wild West, where every story rides through the dust, the danger, and the kind of love that never dies. See you in the next tale, partner.